Kelly Nelson, a wonderful writer I recently discovered, has graciously permitted me to present an article she wrote on June 11, 2024. Its title is The Culmination of Marxist Infiltration, Part 1, Intel Agency Transformation. She starts with a few quotes which I shall recite. If a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back. Frank Church, 1975. You can't come forward against the world's most powerful intelligence agencies and be completely free from risk. Edward Snowden. Intelligence agencies keep things secret because they often violate the rule of law or of good behavior. Julian Assange. Here at last you witness the real Barack Obama. The sound you hear in the background is the cracking of Obama's nimbus of benevolent moderation. This is not change we can believe in. It is left-wing radicalism aimed at the foundations of the American system of government. Diana West, author of American Betrayal. The secret assault on our nation's character. We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. Barack Obama, October 30, 2008. And he also said, we cannot continue to rely on our military in order to achieve the national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful, just as strong, just as well-funded. Obama had the worldview, training, organization, and talent networks he needed to fundamentally transform America. 2 years into his presidency, the conversion of the FBI and CIA, as well as the rest of the intelligence community, had begun. This is the story of the players and their eventual goals. Introducing the Institute for Social Research. The 18 organizations who comprise the U.S. intelligence community have been weaponized against domestic enemies, i.e., patriotic American citizens. Intel has long been infiltrated with cultural Marxism by followers of Gramsci and members from the Frankfurt School, also known as the Institute for Social Research. The founding of the Institute marked the beginning of a current of Marxism divorced from the organized working class and communist parties, which over the decades merged with bourgeois ideology in academia. Soon after Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, the Institute first moved from Frankfurt to Geneva and then to New York City in 1935, where it found hospitality at Columbia University. The school's journal, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Journal of Social Research, was renamed Studies in Philosophy and Social Science. Founded by Karl Grunberg in 1923 as an adjunct of the University of Frankfurt, the Institute was the first Marxist-oriented research center affiliated with a major German university. Max Horkheimer took over as director in 1930 and recruited many talented theorists, including T.W. Adorno, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and Walter Benjamin. Frankfurt School members tried to develop a theory of society based on Marxism and Hegelian philosophy. Tied with some of Sigmund Freud's theories, they utilized the insights of psychoanalysis, sociology, and existential philosophy, along with other disciplines. Marxist concepts to analyze the social relations within capitalistic economic systems became known as critical theory, a school of thought and interdisciplinary movement that combines social and cultural analysis with Marxist-oriented political philosophy. It looks at society in a way to challenge power structures. Both former FBI Director James Comey and Director Christopher Wray are promoting critical theory in the entire FBI. Critical law theory, so-called education, began to be noticeable in the Clinton administration, and attitudes began to change. That's when we saw the cultural byproducts of American education now taught in our universities. It is the Herbert Marcuse Marxist and Freudian theories which became so influential in the leftist student movements of the 1960s, especially after the 1968 student rebellions in Paris and West Berlin and at New York City's Columbia University. From 1934 to 1942, Marcuse worked at the Institute's branch at Columbia University. In 1942, he moved to Washington, D.C. to work first with the Office of War Information and then with the Office of Strategic Services. Later, Marcuse would teach at Brandeis University and then the University of California, San Diego. Marcuse's critical law theory is now being taught in almost every university. It is Marx's communist interpretation of using the law as a weapon. Critical race theory, CRT, makes race the prism through which its proponents analyze all aspects of American life, categorizing individuals into groups of oppressors and victims. The critical theorist argues that to eliminate prejudice, Christianity, capitalism, and the traditional patriarchal family all had to be destroyed. This approach yielded influential critiques of large corporations and monopolies, the role of technology, the industrialization of culture, and the decline of the individual within capitalist society. Fascism and authoritarianism were also prominent subjects of study. Published in the Institute's journal, Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, 1932-41, Journal for Social Research. The followers of Gramsci and Frankfurt have stretched public opinion and interpretations of law to make incremental gains that are now obvious. They've credentialed extremists in mainstream institutions, and they're cultivating new radicals to penetrate, infiltrate, and occupy even more institutions. With a hat tip to Chairman Mayo, they've succeeded in their long march through all of America's institutions. Their end goal is at hand: the actual destruction of our representative republic, our Constitution, and removal of a president not chosen by the Marxist infiltrators. J. Michael Waller's book, Big Intel, lays bare how the Marxist worldview has corrupted the entire American intelligence community. This is the story. Now enter Bill Ayers, Obama and radicalism. In 1995, a radical Illinois state senator saw promise in Barack Hussein Obama and introduced him to Bill Ayers and his wife, Bernadine Dorn, the 1960 Radicals. Ayers' network, the Weathermen, was a political faction elected in 1968 to lead the radical group, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. They were responsible for domestic violence, bombings, shootings, and murders across the United States and were allied with cop killers, mass shooters, and other violent extremists. They built radical union-affiliated cells and a block-by-block structure of community organizing. SDS also gave us the Chicago 7, a group of political activists who were arrested for their anti-war activities during the August 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Illinois. Mayor Daley instituted a 10 p.m. curfew and called out the National Guard to quell the violence throughout the city. Daley's television announcement told Chicago that he ordered the police to shoot to kill any arsonists and shoot to injure any looters. Tanks rolled down the streets on the north side of Chicago. The SDS members worked to force universities to hire radical allies as professors, who are today major influencers throughout academia. Ayers ended up as a professor at the University of Chicago. Herbert Marcuse, a prominent member of the Marxist Frankfurt School of Critical Social Analysis, had been Ayers' professor and advisor. Angela Davis, a Black Power militant who bought the weapon used to kill a California state judge, was a student of Frankfurt School's Herbert Marcuse. She then moved to communist East Germany to receive a PhD, and later, in Moscow, to receive the Lenin Peace Prize from Brezhnev. In the 70s, we left a church in Bloomington, Indiana, because congregant funds were being sent to support communist Angela Davis. Valerie Jarrett. The Frankfurt Red Thread was passed from Marcuse to Ayers and Dorn, and finally to Valerie Jarrett, and onward to Michelle and Barack Obama. FBI files obtained by Judicial Watch reveal that the dad, maternal grandpa, and father-in-law of President Obama's trusted senior advisor, Valerie Jarrett, were hardcore communists under investigation by the U.S. government. Her father-in-law had a relationship with Frank Marshall Davis, who decades later would mentor young Obama. According to FBI files, Jarrett's relatives were heavily involved with a group, Communist Party USA, whose mission was to fundamentally transform the American form of government and way of life. Jarrett and her commie friends were instrumental in working with other Communist Party radicals to elect Chicago Mayor Harold Washington and Senator Carol Moseley Braun. The senator had a penchant for calling close associates comrade. Current and former aides said, "Obama has said he consults Jarrett on every major decision." In her book, The Red Threat, Diana West writes, Obama himself recalls attending socialist conferences in the 1980s at Cooper Union in New York City. Later, Obama was the political protege of a lifelong pro-Moscow and pro-communist operative named Alice Palmer. She launched Obama's political career inside the home of SDS and Weather Underground terrorists Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. They had spent the 1960s and 1970s in treasonous cooperation with revolutionary communist governments in China, North Vietnam, and Cuba. Obama's key political aides on the road to the White House were Valerie Jarrett and David Axelrod. Both were descended from, and mentored by, communist and/or Soviet operatives who were also closely associated with Frank Marshall Davis in Chicago, historically a hub of communist Soviet activity in the USA. The real Kremlin puppet was never Donald Trump, rather Barack Hussein Obama. Later, Obama was the political protege of a lifelong pro-Moscow and pro-communist operative named Alice Palmer. She launched Obama's political career inside the home of SDS and Weather Underground terrorists Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. They had spent the 1960s and 1970s in treasonous cooperation with revolutionary communist governments in China, North Vietnam, and Cuba. Obama's key political aides on the road to the White House were Valerie Jarrett and David Axelrod. Both were descended from, and mentored by, communist and/or Soviet operatives who were also closely associated with Frank Marshall Davis in Chicago, historically a hub of communist Soviet activity in the USA. The real Kremlin puppet was never Donald Trump, rather Barack Hussein Obama. Now for Eric Holder. President Reagan appointed Holder as a District of Columbia Superior Court Associate Judge. Clinton made him U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and then tapped him for Deputy Attorney General under Janet Reno. Holder met Obama in 2004 and they immediately clicked. He had been a student radical at Columbia and belonged to a militant group tied to the Students for a Democratic Society. He became a fanatical devotee of the Black Panthers who embraced Marxism, Leninism, and openly called for Maoist-style guerrilla warfare in the United States. Holder became part of the armed mob that took over a vacant naval ROTC office for a 5-day occupation. They wanted the space because of the general racist nature of American society and claimed Columbia was also racist. With Obama, Holder returned to his radical roots. He clashed with Republican legislators in the wake of Operation Fast and Furious, a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives investigation of gun trafficking on the U.S.-Mexico border from late 2009 to early 2011. Border Agent Brian Terry died as a result. After Holder failed to respond to a congressional subpoena of documents relating to the operation, and in spite of an assertion of executive privilege by Obama, the Republican-led House voted in June 2012 to find Holder in contempt of Congress. The vote marked the first time that a sitting member of the cabinet had been cited for contempt. Unlike Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, Holder wasn't sent to prison. In 2017, Holder became chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and took time off from Covington and Burling law firm to travel to various states to formulate a centralized strategy for gaining control of the redistricting process. Centralizing intel agencies. Post 9/11, FBI Director Robert Mueller was kept on for 2 more years by Obama after his 10-year term under President George W. Bush was up. Excuses for the tragedy of 9/11 included the failure of intelligence communities to communicate with each other. Mueller added a top-heavy bureaucracy to the FBI to ensure future cooperative knowledge by creating 63 new executive positions at headquarters and doubling the size of the bureau. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 consolidated various domestic security entities, all in the name of fighting terrorism. Congresses and presidents had deliberately dispersed the intelligence duties across the government to avoid consolidation of power. But in the name of fighting terrorism, Bush and Congress merged 22 of them into one concentration of power under the 2003 Department of Homeland Security. Within 6 weeks of the 9/11 attack, the predatory American security state was born with the passage of the USA Patriot Act. It was to expire in 4 years. It authorized unprecedented surveillance of American citizens and individuals worldwide without traditional civil liberties safeguards. It beefed up surveillance procedures and warrantless wiretapping under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, to enable the government to spy on Americans. FISA was just reauthorized by Speaker Mike Johnson, without protections against warrantless search and seizure. The Patriot Act finally expired in March 2020 without being reauthorized, but federal law enforcement agencies retain most of the authorities that were granted by the Act. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act created a new government agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It mushroomed to a force of 2,000 and grew a brand new headquarters in D.C. The U.S. intelligence community had been decentralized among 13 autonomous agencies, both civilian and military. But after 9/11, it became an octopus with tentacles reaching into every facet of the federal government and out into the corporate world. John Brennan, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency under Obama, and James Clapper, former director of National Intelligence under Obama, both signed on to the Democrat-concocted FISA applications authorizing domestic spying on the Republican Party presidential team. Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe, Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and Secretary of State John Kerry also signed on. The Marxian 5-year plan was completed in Obama's second term. The intelligence community, equal employment opportunity, and diversity enterprise strategy was unveiled in 2015. It was the beginning of the new cultural Marxist commissariat, which allowed James Clapper to impose diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the entire intelligence community. In Obama's second term, he appointed his aide, John Brennan, as CIA director. Brennan had served at the top of the CIA under Clinton and Bush 43, but like Clapper, he had a radical past. When he first applied to the CIA during the Carter administration, he didn't think they'd accept him since he had voted for communist Gus Hall for president. They somehow cleared him, despite his background being closely aligned with Holder, and especially Valerie Jarrett. Brennan executed Obama's diversity order by increased hiring and promotions consistent with Obama's critical theory criteria. Some analysts called Brennan's politicization of the CIA soft totalitarianism. The pieces were all in place for the radical transformation of America. A planned military coup. Into the limelight came Donald John Trump, and the Obama apparatus went to work. Georgetown University's Professor Rosa Brooks heads up the Transition Integrity Project, TIP, founded in 2019. The project was created to play out different outcomes from the 2020 presidential election and see how each outcome would be handled. The result was obvious: peaceful outcomes with Biden, explosive riots and protests with Trump. If the transition from Trump to Biden wasn't orderly, the military would intervene to remove Donald Trump. 2 weeks after Trump was elected in 2016, Brooks wrote that they had to find a way to remove him from power. At the same time, she called for getting rid of civilian control of the military, but didn't state who would take it over. It doesn't end there. A military coup is planned. Rosa Brooks claims that if Trump is elected in 2024, they must find a way to remove him. This is being planned through Georgetown University Law Center. the premier law school in D.C. It's a feeder school to the Justice Department, to Supreme Court clerks, and to the entire intelligence community. Everything is planned there. In Part 2, we'll let you in on what the Transition Integrity Project has planned.